Hello, and congratulations for listening to Non-Theology. This is a weekly or bi-weekly or whenever we want to do it podcast about theology, non-theology, and everything in between. You can visit us online at nontheology.com and send your questions, comments, concerns, and hate mail to nontheology@gmail.com. I am one of the two hosts, Gabe, and I'm joined, of course, by the other of the two hosts, Eric.
The last time I tried to jump in with some random thoughts that I had been pondering recently, I got scolded by Gabriel because it didn't have anything at all to do with the episode.
Because it's always about Wendy's with you.
Well, a lot of the time it is, but the last time it wasn't going to be. And I think next episode I'm going to try to circle back around and see if I can sneak what I wanted to talk about before in. But I'll save that for next episode, and we can just get right into the meat and potatoes of this episode. And I'll spare you my random thoughts.
We'll see if next time you can be clever enough to do that.
I'm sure I'll sneak it in somehow.
Well, anyway, this is going to be another Mormon episode, which always excites me. Eric, you've complained in the past that Mormonism is boring as hell, which is kind of true. That's not
necessarily what I have said, but in any case,
it's really more of a function of the fact that I'm boring, and I'm the only one of the two of us that knows much about Mormonism.
Sure, I'll go along with that, no problem.
But we've brought in some hired muscle to talk about this. We are joined on the line by philosopher, physician, and critic of Superman fan fiction, Chuck Morrison.
The last one's my favorite. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, Chuck, you're well known on the internet as the creator of the once popular, then defunct, and now possibly resurrected podcast, Irreligiosophy.
Yeah, we've had our second coming. Take that, Christ.
This was a problem that I had right away. Maybe you should spell Irreligiosophy real quick, just so in case anybody who happened to be listening to our podcast wants to search you out, they can get at it.
I'll put a link to it.
Great, good idea.
No one can spell it.
I couldn't figure out how to find it just based on hearing the name of it.
Helping people find it's kind of antithetical to the spirit of the podcast.
Okay, sure, fair enough.
If you can't find it, you don't deserve to listen to it.
I like that.
There's kind of a weeding out process.
Exactly.
That's a good plan.
Well, it's a good thing I had Gabriel to help me get in past the dragnet, or else I think I wouldn't have. Perhaps I don't deserve to have listened to it.
Wouldn't have made the cut.
I'm like the guy in the admission committee. You know, you didn't actually take the GRE, but we'll let you in anyway.
It's good to have friends in high places, I guess.
Exactly.
I think Mormonism is actually more interesting if you live in Utah or if you have Mormon friends. If you don't, it's just kind of like the Amish, you know. I'd rather not listen to the Amish theology all day. I have no point of contact, you know.
Yeah, I would agree with that, actually. I'm not now, nor have I ever been a member of the church. And I didn't really ever get interested in Mormonism until about, maybe a year and a half ago. I got a new job and found out that one of my coworkers is Mormon. And in the first week or so that we were working together, he told me he likes to talk about philosophy, which I took as an invitation to just bug the crap out of him every day. So yeah, he and I end up talking about Mormonism, and that ends up making it far more interesting to me because there's, it's not just some crazy group out in Utah.
Right. Once you get a point of contact, much, much more interesting.
Exactly,
and
yeah.
If you actually live in Utah, then it's you get more of it really than you want to.
I'm sure you're saturated with it.
All the time. And now it's a little more interesting now because we got Mitt Romney running for president. So there's a point of contact for everybody.
I've mentioned that before on the show, that I think part of the reason why people don't, the fact that Mitt Romney is a Mormon is such a not really all that talked about part of the presidential race this year. I think the reason why that's the case is because people aren't really familiar with Mormonism too much, and they think that it's just basically like another Protestant religion or something like that. And they don't really know what it's all about. Do you think that that's the case?
I think it's calculated, yeah. If you bring up any criticism of Mormonism, they immediately throw out that you're a religious bigot. And so they want Mitt to pass as a Protestant. Did you notice in the last debate he called himself a pastor? Jesus Christ.
I didn't catch that, actually.
He said he was a pastor of his church for 10 years. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, they have been doing a lot of spin control. You can tell that they want him to just seem like a normal Christian and not, a Mormon. I was talking to I brought this up in a previous episode also, but I was talking to my family about it, and a lot of my family members are Republicans, and I said to them, "Are you going to vote for the Mormon guy?" And they're like, "Well, what does the fact that he's a Mormon have to do with anything?" They said that's what people said about Kennedy. They said, "Oh, well, you can't have a Catholic be the president." But what does anybody's religion have to do with, whether or not they can be the president? And I was like, "You guys don't know very much about Mormonism, do you?" And they were like, "No." And I was like, "Let me share a few things with you." And so we got to talking about it, and they actually found a lot of the things we talked about to be really interesting. I think they're still going to vote for Mitt Romney anyways, but at least we had that conversation.
Yeah, party loyalty runs pretty deep.
Yeah.
At least they'll have to hold their nose while they do it.
Either that or they've completely forgotten about that conversation altogether.
Yeah, good old cognitive bias where you just forget things that don't already agree with what you believe.
Right, exactly.
All right, well, on to the meat and potatoes of this podcast. We're going to be engaging in a little bit of literary criticism. So one way of critiquing a work of literature is to find inconsistencies in the story. And these inconsistencies fall into one of two categories, either internal or external. External inconsistencies are part of the story that are at odds with the rest of the world outside of the story, and that's what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be finding a type of external inconsistency in the Book of Mormon called an anachronism. So one question on a lot of people's minds may be, what is an anachronism? So an anachronism is just a chronological discrepancy. This is a person or a place or an object or something that doesn't belong in the time period that the story is set in. So if there's an anachronism in a story, that suggests to you that the story doesn't actually originate from the time or place that the story is actually set in. One real quick example of this is in the movie Back to the Future 3, and I was struggling to come up with an example of this because I'm trying to think of something that's both accessible and well-known or something, but I think Back to the Future is a reasonably well-watched series. Back to the Future 3 is when the main characters go back to the year 1885. In the climactic gun scene, in the background, there's a modern California flag that didn't exist until 1911. So, that's an anachronism. That's an example of something that's set in, for example, the year 1885, but there's things in there that didn't exist until much later. And so that just tells you that, aside from the fact that the movie is shot in color, it couldn't have happened in 1885.
Right. I also enjoy I went on the Wikipedia page when I started hearing the word anachronism coming out, and there's comical ones as well. And the Wikipedia page lists like Aladdin, the genie turns into like modern personas and things that didn't exist back then when the movie's supposedly taking place. Also, in the TV show Archer, which I'm a huge fan of. I realized this after I read the thing on Wikipedia, but the Wikipedia page phrases it better than I could. So I'm just going to read that sentence real quick. The cartoon TV series Archer deliberately mixes technologies, clothing styles, and historical backdrops of different decades. The Soviet Union is a current nation. Characters wear 1960s clothing and hairstyles, but they use cell phones, GPS devices, and laser gun sights. So I find that to be really amusing. It's like that kind of gives you a feel for like what we're talking about. Like it can be unintentional, as in I think what we're going to get into like with the Book of Mormon, but it could also be like used for comedic effect, So this sort of idea of things that don't belong in the time or place that they're set in.
Yeah, the classic example is the chariot scene of Ben-Hur. If you watch closely, the guy's got a wristwatch on there. I think
those were around.
Well.
Yeah, if you look really careful, it's a sundial wristwatch, so that's all right.
You just got to make sure you're pointed north.
I like that sundial wristwatch. That's funny.
All right, so Chuck, do you want to explain real fast how the Book of Mormon came to be in the first place? Was this, something that Joseph Smith just found the loose leaf pages or something, or how did this come to be?
Yeah, well, the story goes that a angel, Moroni, appeared to Joseph Smith in his room 3 times in a night, tell him all about how he's, angel of God, and there's a set of golden plates that you need to translate because now that it's time for the last dispensation to come forth and the time for the fullness of the gospel to be found. So he goes up there and I think rolls over a big rock, digs a little bit and finds it, but he wasn't worthy initially. A couple of years later, finally, he's pure and worthy. It removes the plates out and begins translating through the means of a Urim and Thummim, I guess, which were 2 stones.
Were those words he just made up?
I think they're in the Old Testament.
Oh, are they? Okay.
Oh, okay.
I think they are, yeah. Turns out that he just put the stones into a hat and didn't even need the gold plates at all.
Right.
Wait, so he didn't have the gold plates in the hat as well? He just had the stones in the hat?
Just the stones. So this is from, I think, Parley Pratt, or who was the first guy? Martin Harris. I think it was
Harris.
Martin Harris, who acted as his first scribe. He described the process. He'd be behind a curtain, and he would put a couple of rocks in his hat and bend over to make it all dark. And then these characters would appear, right, one at a time. And so he'd translate the plates. So you didn't really need the plates. So I don't know why they bothered saving them. But supposedly the Book of Mormon is a translation from Reformed Egyptian, in quotes, off of these plates that Joseph Smith found in, I think, New York.
And actually, later on when he was translating the Book of Abraham, he also didn't need the rocks or the hat, right?
Right, yeah. He had papyrus that, amazing coincidence, just happened to be preserved Book of Abraham written by the hand of Abraham himself.
Right.
Wow.
It's amazing. The stuff just, follows him around.
That he was able to get his hands on that.
Yeah, really, really lucky that Joe had all these great coincidences that just worked out in his favor.
Yeah, and he dispelled all of that stuff when he did the Book of Moses, I think. He just directly received that as a revelation.
Nice.
Oh, I didn't actually know that.
Yeah.
Okay, so before we get into looking at anachronisms, there's one thing that it merits talking about real fast, just because I think it's going to come up a lot, and that's the difference between a loose translation and a tight translation. So if you're translating something loosely, you're just trying to give a broad overview of the original work and, conveying it more or less into the, language you're translating into. There's not a really good reason to suspect that names or places, events, dates, things like this would be carried through in the translation. I mean, the goal is just to convey a storyline, lessons learned, morals, things like this, but certainly no specifics. And so things like fairy tales are something that would be translated loosely over time. If you read the original Cinderella story and compare it to the modern Cinderella story that you might see in a Disney movie, this is pure loose translation. It's completely different, and actually in this case it might be so loose that the morals and things might not be carried through either. I'm not quite sure about how the original story works. So that's a loose translation. Tight translation is where you've got something word for word, letter for letter. This is conveying precisely and exactly the ideas and meanings, names, place dates, etc. of the original work. And that's really good if you want to translate a historical work or a document or something like that. I mean, because those are the sorts of fine details that you want carried through into the final example.
That's the kind of translation that I would expect in a historical document, or something as important as like a religious text that has eternal ramifications.
Yeah, and when you read about what Joseph Smith said about the Book of Mormon, it really sounds to me like he was intending that to be a tight translation. He was giving names and spelling names out letter by letter, giving dates, things like this. And so it seems to me like Joe would want us to be going with the tight translation. Do you have any thoughts on that, Chuck?
Yeah, I mean, you get into problems in translating stuff from like Greek, for example, or from Hebrew, because the grammatical structures are different.
Yeah.
So if you go through a direct translation, often it won't make any sense.
Right.
Or you'll have to think about it for a while. And so people have various degrees of looseness, and they're trying to keep the meaning of the passage. It's a very difficult process translating, even if it's not magical, like with Joseph Smith. But you're right. He's got all these proper names in there. He's got, we're probably going to talk about animals because that's one of the anachronisms. But two of the animals he mentions are, in terms of elephants, they're like, did you read this part?
I did, yeah.
What are they? Cumellas or cumorphs?
I didn't get into that, actually. No, I don't know what you're talking about.
At the end, he's like listing all these useful animals. And, God, let me see if I can find it. There it is. Curulams and cumoms. So he lists a bunch of animals, elephants, and at the end, I think, curulams and cumoms. So that would be a very tight translation. The answer from apologists, he didn't know what it was, and so he just translated the word. Mm-hmm. So that's a pretty tight translation. If you can get exact phonemes and exact letters, that's impressive. But you'll hear really again and again that, that wasn't what he meant. He didn't mean a horse. He meant something else.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that's kind of a backdoor answer that's always really easy to give. And that's just basically saying, well, let's just assume it's a loose translation and he meant something completely different from a horse.
Right, like a deer.
Yeah, a deer or a tapir or something.
Because Joseph Smith didn't know what a deer was.
Right.
Like the Native Americans are freaking Santa Claus riding all these reindeer all around.
Right.
It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
But yeah, we can talk about that when we get to it.
Yeah. Well, I think that's more than enough background to get into this. Does anyone want to start us off?
I'm going to opt out. I'm not qualified to start us off.
Yeah, there are tons of things. We can talk about steel, horses, wheat, barley, coinage. My favorite isn't Anachronism of the Book of Mormon, isn't any of these things. It's a speech of Abinadi in Mosiah 16. So the setup for this is that Abinadi has been captured by King Noah. He's in the court of King Noah, and he's doing all this preaching right before he's going to get executed by King Noah. So he's talking about Christ. This is 148 BC, according to the Book of Mormon. So it's 150 years before Christ is born in the Americas. So Mosiah 16:6 says, "And now if Christ had not come into the world, speaking of things to come as though they had already come, there could have been no redemption. And if Christ had not risen from the dead, or have broken the bands of death, that the grave should have no victory, and that death should have no sting, there could have been no resurrection." Can you imagine anyone, say someone comes up right now and tells you, 150 years from now, something's going to happen. Now, I'm going to talk for the next 5 minutes as if it had already happened. It doesn't make any sense at all.
I like that. That is a good one.
Like I said, there are tons of stuff like steel and horses, and take your pick. Which ones do you like?
I actually always fancy the horses, animals in general. The Book of Mormon mentions a lot of different animals that are in there. I guess I'll just take this opportunity to go into my little thing here. So the Book of Mormon, will list horses, goats, elephants, cattle, and pigs, and probably a handful of others as well. I'm going to talk about horses specifically just because really the same thing can be said for just about all of these. All right, so the horses are talked about over and over again in the Book of Mormon. One quick quote from 1 Nephi 18:25. "And it came to pass that we did find upon the land of promise, as we journeyed into the wilderness, that there were beasts in the forest of every kind, both the cow and the ox, the ass and the horse, the goat and the wild goat, and all manner of wild animals, which were for the use of man."
I just want to interrupt you here. I like how he differentiates between goat and the wild goat.
Yeah,
so,
I have that underlined in my Book of Mormon, yeah.
They showed up, and the goat has already been domesticated. That's awesome.
Yeah, exactly. And, yeah, horses are brought up at least 5 other times throughout the book. Now, what makes this an anachronism? We think of Native Americans, they rode horses, right? So how could this possibly be an anachronism? Well, according to our best archaeology, horses went extinct on the American continent around 10,000 BC during the Holocene era. And they weren't reintroduced onto the continent until the very end of the 15th century by the Spanish explorers. We've really done pretty extensive, although of course not exhaustive, archaeological research on the entire North and South American continent, and we don't find any evidence of horses after about 10,000 BC. This is a period of over 11,000 years of actually really recent history, and so we really should expect to find some evidence of horses if they were around.
We find them all over in Europe.
Yeah,
all
exactly.
Over the place.
They're commonplace.
Not only that, but the horse itself, not just the horse fossils, right? So we can't find a single horse tooth, bone, rib, anything in North America after about 10,000, between 10,000 and the reintroduction in 1492 when Columbus came across. And now the Book of Mormon period is directly in between that. So it runs from about 2000 BC with the Jaredites, and then the actual main portion of the Book of Mormon is between about 600 BC and about 400 AD. So that's well within, right in between that 10,000 extinction and the reintroduction in the 15th century. And they're all over in the Book of Mormon. It's unbelievable. Not only horses, but chariots. Not only do we have no bones, though, we have no pottery, we have no depictions, we've got no pictures, we got no paintings, nothing.
Yeah, exactly. And that's all stuff that we really should expect to find somewhere on the North or South American continent.
Right. It just like we see it in Europe, all over the place.
Right.
So then, Gabe, I suppose it's probably about time to ask, what is the apologist response to all of these contentions that we have just, all of these criticisms that we have just leveled against the fact that there probably weren't actually any horses there at that time?
Yeah, so there's basically 2 apologetic responses that I'll see for this. The first one is basically to say, go with the loose translation, say it was some other animal. Chuck, you mentioned deer. They will also say it's llamas or tapirs. And they've also brought this up with other animals as well. Now, the problem with this is horses are discussed as being used in battle. In Alma 26, it says, "Now when Lamoni had heard this, he caused that his servants should make ready his horses and his chariots." Now, deer and tapirs are incredibly ill-suited for battle.
No, people ride deer into battle all the time. Or at least they used to back then anyways.
No, I mean, you can't do anything with these animals other than eat them.
Yeah.
Llamas, on the other hand, are okay for light labor. They were certainly the best thing that there was around on the pre-Columbian American continent, but you can't take them into battle. They're slow and skittish, and aren't really going to be good for anything other than being a nuisance in combat.
I mean, deer are prey animals. Deer are afraid of anything that moves other than other deer.
Right.
And leaves and trees. They're certainly not going to ride in formation with people on them into a battle with other. Yeah, that's not going to happen. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So aside from just going the backdoor loose translation route, there's a guy named Dr. Wade Miller who's a professor of geology at surprise BYU.
Nice.
And he's basically just denying that our understanding of pre-Columbian archaeology is really up to par. He says that he's got carbon-14 dates of horses as recent as 800 years, and other dates up to 1,200 and 1,400 years ago. Now, the problem is, I can't find any support for this at all. He doesn't appear to have published this data, let alone had it peer-reviewed, so I have a really hard time believing that this is actually representative of things that he's found, if he's telling the truth at all. Really, the only place that I've seen him say this is at Mormon apologetics conferences and faith-promoting literature, stuff like this.
Yeah, that's one tack. That's interesting. I never heard that tack that actually claimed that the entire field of paleoarchaeology is wrong for the Northern.
Everybody but me is wrong.
Right.
I'm right. Another is that, NF equals NE, not found does not equal not exist, right?
Right.
We just haven't found them yet.
Well, and he's talking about horse fossils, and horse fossils are one thing. Although, again, this would be a lot easier to swallow if there was some independent verification of this. Maybe someone who's not an LDS apologist could actually publish that data in a reputable archaeological journal. But no, we get this stuff at Mormon apologetics conferences.
Yeah, I mean, where you're speaking at a group of people who want to hear evidence that supports what they want to be true. And so they're not ever going to raise their hand and be like, wait a minute, does anybody else, is a peer review article about this anywhere? You're not going to get that contention in that setting.
Yeah, but so he's talking about horse fossils, and that's fine. If he's got that data, I'd love to see it. But there's another hurdle that, is in his way. And that's the fact that the Book of Mormon, like I said, is talking about domesticated horses that are being used in battle. If we're talking about domesticated horses, Chuck, like you said, we need to find some evidence of their domestication. Domesticating and caring for an animal like a horse is something that requires some serious infrastructure in society. I mean, you can't be a roving band of hunter-gatherers and domesticate horses. Those two types of activities just don't cross paths. I mean, we need to find specialized tools and evidence of agriculture that will support horses. Drawings and pottery, stuff like that, but we don't find any of it.
Right, absolutely. Where are the saddles? Where are the reins? Where's the leatherworks? Where's
I like that,
the shoeing industry? Where's all of this stuff? None of them. So we have to accept his claim that he's found a couple of horse fossils. Apparently, every other aspect, every cultural, and when we brought horses over into and introduced into the Native American tribes, it revolutionized their entire culture. I mean, you mentioned when we think about Native Americans, we think about them mounted on a horseback, right?
Right.
Charging into battle. The only tribes that actually survived as long as they did survived because they adapted to horseback and the battle of the day. They got guns, they got horses, and they transformed their entire culture so that it was kind of based on the horse. So, and that happens almost every time you introduce something like that into a culture. And we have no examples of this at all for thousands of years.
Mm-hmm.
So that apologetic demands ignorance of all of the rest of this stuff. And that works mostly for believing Mormons.
Exactly, yeah.
Right?
Yeah, Eric and I were talking about this actually a little bit before the show. A lot of apologists can just say whatever they want because they're relying on the fact that they know that people who are listening to them who are already believers aren't going to look this stuff up. They're just going to accept it as the right answer, but they're not going to take the time to really fact check this themselves.
They'd rather not know.
Exactly, yeah. So that's my little bit about horses in the Book of Mormon. You can pretty much say the same thing for all the other animals that I listed. There's one other funny note that I wanted to bring up about elephants. Elephants are also listed in the Book of Mormon. Now, the problem is, elephants never existed natively on the American continent. Some apologists are going to say that this actually refers to mammoths, again, going with this loose translation thing. Now, the problem is that mammoths also died out in the Holocene, long before the Book of Mormon was written, so they're definitely not doing themselves any favors by replacing one animal that never existed on the continent with another animal that went extinct thousands of years before the story in the Book of Mormon.
Right.
Yeah, it's impressive.
Yeah.
And we'll get as more of these, the apologetics kind of stack up on each other. You get to the point where you have to say, okay, what are the odds that there's an exception to every single rule here, or you guys are just trying to prop up a failing history?
Yeah.
It just doesn't work. I found, by the way, Ether 919 is one that mentions elephants. This is the one. And they also had horses and asses, and there were elephants and curulams and cumoms, all of which were useful unto man, and more especially the elephants and curulams and cumoms.
They've got some pretty precise information about like which ones were, better or worse.
Right.
Yeah, so apparently not only were the elephants and curulams and cumoms there, but they were domesticated.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I love it.
Yeah, so let me wrap up this section about animals by reading a quote. I took a class in college, and I'm going to cite this textbook. This is, of course, a field full of just bitter anti-Mormon apostates, History of Economics.
Yes.
So this book is a concise economic history of the world, from Paleolithic times to the present. On page 104, it says, the pre-Columbian Indians of America had no domesticated animals except dogs and llamas. The Spanish introduced horses, cattle, sheep, donkeys, goats, pigs, and most domesticated fowl. So that actually quite nicely wraps up almost every animal mentioned in the Book of Mormon as saying, no, it wasn't there. The Spanish brought it in like the 1500s.
Yeah, isn't it suspicious that all of this stuff that Joseph Smith is aware of is European? Why does he mention a turkey once? Why is there no turkey in the Book of Mormon?
Yeah, exactly.
There's tons of other animals. Why not deer or jaguars or monkeys or sloths? I mean, why not any of these?
Yeah, like you said, to accept the apologetic response, it just demands ignorance of reality.
Yeah.
But that's all I've got to say about the whole animal thing in the Book of Mormon. Who's next?
Well, just real quick, the one that I have done a bit of reading on myself is about steel or iron in the Book of Mormon. And it gets mentioned several times. However, it wasn't in the United States, or not. I'm not going to call it the United States. That would be another flaw. That it wasn't around in that area in North America at that time. But the Book of Mormon, it mentions iron and steel, and I did a little bit of reading, and the one that really interests me the most is because here's the apologetic response is they'll say, well, they weren't talking about steel because they had stuff back then that was like hardened copper. So they're probably just talking about like copper tools and not like steel tools and weapons and stuff. And so you go, and the most interesting like sort of reference that I found in the actual Book of Mormon is from Nephi or Second Nephi, chapter 5, I think. Yeah, chapter 5, verse 15. And it goes like this. It says, "And I did teach my people to build buildings, and to work in all manner of wood, and of iron, and of copper, and of brass, and of steel, and of gold, and of silver, and of precious ores which were in great abundance." So it's like they've got iron, steel, copper, brass, gold, silver, all separated as separate different things. And I'm not an expert, but it seems to me a bit strange to think that when they're talking about iron and steel, if they were actually talking about brass or copper, why didn't they say brass and copper? Because they obviously had that as well. So I don't understand how you can have...
They did say brass and copper. They just also said iron and steel.
Right, yeah. But what I mean... yeah, you see the point I'm trying to make.
He's differentiating them there. Right there, he's saying he knows the difference between copper and steel. They're two different words.
So the argument... yeah.
And the metallurgists around when Joseph Smith was translating this, they knew the difference between brass, iron, steel, and copper. This was no mystery to the Caucasian people that Joseph Smith was surrounded by. And so it seems really bizarre that if you just meant like several different alloys of copper and stuff like this, that you would actually specifically name these other completely independent metals. That just doesn't make any sense.
I'm not sure what Joseph Smith is trying to say there, but it does mention both of them. Mm-hmm. So when the apologists try to conflate them, say, well, he was translating steel when he should have said copper, that verse in 2nd Nephi kind of puts the lie to that. Well, my favorite thing for steel is Ether 7:9. So this is the Jaredites, I think. So this is like 2,000 years before Christ. Ether 7:9 says, "Wherefore he came to the hill Ephraim, and he did molten out of the hill, and made swords out of steel for those whom he had drawn away with him. And after he had armed them with swords, he returned to the city Nahor, and he gave battle unto his brother Korihor, by which means he obtained the kingdom and restored it unto his father Kib." So there you have it. They apparently invented smelting of steel way back in 2000 BC.
Right.
Right.
And things like smelting, just like horses, this is another thing that really requires an awful lot of supporting technology and infrastructure in a society. Smelting steel, just mining it in the first place, requires a lot of technical know-how. There's hardly any evidence to suggest that the peoples of the American continent had any idea about.
Yeah, well, yeah, right. You're not only finding mines, which they have mines, but you're finding, you should find the whole smelting industry. You should find the tailings. You should find the smelting ovens. I think dross is mentioned in the Book of Mormon as well.
Right, which is a byproduct of smelting steel, isn't it?
Right, and so it's the impurities. And so, I think that maybe it's Alma who's saying that, and he's speaking to the people as if they all understand what dross is. So it's very common, right?
Right.
There it is. Therefore, this is 29. This is Alma 34:29. Therefore, if ye do not remember to be charitable, ye are as dross, which the refiners do cast out, it being of no worth, and is trodden under foot of men. So he's talking to people about being, if you're not charitable, then you're worthless. And this would not be understandable to the people he's preaching to if smelting weren't very common.
Right. That is a nice little analogy. But yeah, it doesn't exactly historically line up, so to speak. And
I guess you can be an apologist about this and say, well, yeah, then the people he was preaching to just had no idea what he was talking about.
And that is one effective preacher. Might as well be speaking Greek to them.
Right.
Yeah, they'll say maybe it was mistranslated because they find, I think, flaked obsidian swords. And so maybe they say that, well, he didn't know what the flaked obsidian was, and so he just translate that as steel. But unfortunately, also you have references of rust as well, I think, in Ether, that their swords were anchored with rust.
Yeah, which you definitely don't get out of obsidian.
Right. So that's a tough one.
It is, yeah. Obsidian is a naturally occurring mineral, basically, and it definitely doesn't rust. You're not going to get obsidian remnants that have rust in them. It just doesn't make any sense. They're already in their natural low energy state. They don't need to oxidize. They're going to be fine as they are.
It's like a volcanic glass, very sharp but prone to flaking, I think. And
yeah, it's very brittle.
And brittle, right? The Egyptians, I think, used them to prepare mummies. But it's tough to use in battle because it breaks very easily.
Yeah.
But, if that's all you got and it's really sharp, that's what you use.
Right.
But yeah, it's not a metal, so it's not going to rust. That kind of brings us into coinage. There's a whole section in the Book of Mormon where it describes coins. For what reason, I can't understand. Again, this is in Alma 11, so Alma is just after Abinadi, so this is probably 140 BC or so, and he's talking about the coinage system, which if, say, I'm writing a book to you guys, would I have to describe pennies, nickels, dimes, dollars, $10 denomination?
I've got it under control.
Yeah.
Thanks, though.
Exactly. So why he's bringing this up, I have no idea, but these are the words Joseph Smith loved to make up words. He says, and the judge received for his wages according to his time a senning of gold for a day, or a senum of silver, which is equal to a senning of gold. And this according to the law which was given. Now the reckoning is thus: a senning of gold, a seon of gold, a shum of gold, and a limna of gold, a senum of silver, an amnor of silver, an esrom of silver, and an ontai of silver. A senum of silver was equal to a senning of gold, and either for a measure of barley, which is also an anachronism.
Right.
Also for a measure of kind of grain. And it goes on like this. There's never been any evidence of coinage system. I think they traded cocoa beans as their most common form of currency.
Yeah, this History of Economics book that I have also talks about how they pretty much traded cacao beans.
Right, yeah. Now, think of how impressive that would be if Joseph Smith described a monetary system based on beans.
Right.
Instead of the classic European silver, gold, copper, that sort of thing. It didn't have to be this way, right? We could have found out that the Native Americans, these people of the time, used gold, silver, and copper. It's just not true. As a matter of fact, they used it for decoration. So you've got like gold mines, that sort of thing. When Pizarro captured the emperor of the Incas, the emperor noticed that he was really interested in all the gold. So he said, I tell you what, I'll fill a room this high, and he's holding his hand, all the way up as high as he could. I'll fill a room this high with gold, and you let me go. It was worthless to them except as decoration.
Right.
He actually did fill the room that high with gold, and then Pizarro killed him. There you go.
Yay, history.
Yeah, so we have yet to find any metallic money system or any system of coinage whatsoever. What do the apologists say about that?
That's not one that I really looked into for the apologist response. I don't know, but I agree. This is stuff that Joseph could have gotten right, and if you're being instructed through divine translation about what was actually going on at the time, it would have been really easy for him to get this stuff right.
Yeah, psst, it wasn't a shum of gold, it was a cacao of bean.
Right.
Hey, Joseph. Yeah, I think what they say is we just haven't found it yet. I think we've looked, but we haven't dug up everything. We'll find it.
Yeah, again, like that is just so unimpressive to say that, because not only is it like, okay, if this was all that common, chances are we would have found it by now, but we haven't. That's unbelievable enough to me. But on top of that, you have, not only is it that we haven't found it yet, but we also are aware of what it actually was that they were doing, and you have to just completely ignore all the evidence to the contrary. So it's not only lack of positive evidence for your side, but it's just completely outrightly dismissing all of the evidence against that is directly refuting what you're saying. And I just don't understand how anybody is impressed by that. I guess other than the fact that if it's just that you want it to be true, so you're not concerned about whether or not it's actually feasible.
Yeah, and actually, there's another point that you just made me think about. Gold and silver coins are, it doesn't even really matter how far back in the past you go. If you've got gold and silver coins, they are invariably extraordinarily well preserved. And that's because gold and silver don't oxidize. They're one of the very few types of metals that you can find in just chunks out in nature. They don't break apart. They're already in a low energy state. So if you expose them to salt water or oxygen or any sort of other, unless you're exposing them to electric current, they're really not going to break down at all. And so to say that we just haven't found the gold coins, again, you have to disbelieve a lot of chemistry to suggest that these have just been lost to time or something like this.
Right. It's a hope, I think, that only works for people who are already Mormon. It's not convincing to anyone else. It's just say, hey, look, we haven't found it yet. Just keep faith. Eventually be found, and then you'll be vindicated.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
The Egyptians called gold the eternal metal because it didn't rust. That's why they had a bunch of their sarcophagi in gold. Mm-hmm. They thought that it would keep the body eternally young, basically.
Nice. That's very clever of them. Perhaps not correct, but I see where they're coming from at least.
Right, exactly. But the fact that, it shouldn't get eaten away, right? It should still be there. And we found caches of hundreds of gold coins from this era, from the Roman era. So there's no reason why we wouldn't be able to find them in the Americas.
Yeah.
Right.
If they existed.
Exactly, yeah.
Chuck, I'm glad to have heard you say just a little while ago that Joseph Smith was in the habit of just kind of making words up, because my experience with the Book of Mormon is not by any means extensive, but what I do notice every time I am looking at it is like, man, how do you pronounce a lot of these words? What language is this? And I'm thinking like, well, I guess I shouldn't worry too much about like how to pronounce these words, because chances are they just were made up by somebody anyways, and they're not like really from anything at all. So, I mean, is that the case that like a lot of these words, like, you know, all these names of these people that don't sound like they're from any particular nation or anything, or these words about denominations of currency, they're just all made up by Joseph Smith, more or less?
That is totally true. If you look at his Book of Abraham sketch, where he gives all of the pagan gods, that they're actually the canopic jars where you keep the organs, right? But he says they're idols, these idols to these gods. He makes up these weirdest names, Libnah and Sheza and all this crap. He loved doing that stuff. Loved it.
That is, one, hilarious to me to hear that, and two, just kind of like satisfying in a way, because I've often thought like, I feel like Joseph Smith's just making these words up. Like, he just makes it up as he goes along. Like, how much gold is that? Oh, that's a schlemmum of gold. Oh, okay, great, thanks. You know, like, is that what he did? I guess so. So good. Glad to hear it.
I remember he was walking around, and there are all these mounds, right, in the Northeast. He was walking around with a bunch of Mormons behind him, and there's this massive mound, and he stops there and he says, my mind is being opened by God, and I know now that this mound is the last burial place of one of the great prophets, Zelph.
Yeah. It does sound made up. I mean, it's like a lot of the words are like, they sound similar, but they're just like the first letter is different. You know, like, well, we've got a schlemmum of gold, and then we've got a mlemmum of gold, and then a blemmum of gold, and it's just like, it doesn't even sound like he tried very hard. It's kind of like the first word that pops into my mind, that's what that is. Hopefully I remember that next time. Because, you know, I would imagine there was times when he came back around and called the exact same thing something else, but nobody else remembered, because, you know, they had never heard it before either, so...
Yeah, it's and he's the expert. Then he makes up all this shit, and you know he's the only expert that knows all this.
Right,
like
and,
there's a shiblum. A shiblum is a half of a shiblon, and a leah is a half of a shiblum. I mean, he goes on and on for like 15 verses. Ridiculous.
Now, the one thing that I will say, I do get the impression that Joe actually had a pretty decent memory when it came to stuff like this. I mean, he was, the same names, the same weird made-up sounding names come up over and over again in the Book of Mormon, and he's apparently not confusing these characters. But then again, it's not that hard to do if you're making up the story, if you're the author.
Yeah, he, I don't know how much he referred back to the Book of Mormon after he had done it. He'll say general stuff like Lamanites and Alma and major characters. I wonder how good his memory actually was for the specifics of it.
Yeah, that's a good point. I've never read anything about him going back and going over stuff. I would imagine he did. I mean, he could read, so I don't know.
It's interesting to me that he comes upon that mound and he just makes up a character that's not in the Book of Mormon, Zelph. Instead of referencing like, oh, this is where King Mosiah was buried, you know?
It kind of reminds me of like Lord of the Rings or something like that, where they're walking around and like every single like thing has a different name that like harrows back to some story from before, and like you never really get into that story, but it's got a name. Trust me. Don't worry about who Zelph was. He's important, and we'll just leave it at that. You know?
Right.
Yeah, I would imagine that later that night around the campfire, whatever these guys were doing as they were romping around. Was that in Missouri, Chuck? You know?
I can't remember.
Yeah, I don't know, but I would imagine there was some fun story that Joe told later that night about Zelph.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of like Joseph Smith's memory and like the specifics and stuff, correct me if I'm wrong, but somewhere like around the time when he's actually writing the Book of Mormon, and I believe that I remember this from the South Park episode, so who knows who knows exactly how correct this is.
We could never go through an episode without you bringing up your knowledge from South Park.
Well, okay, but there is a point in the story where like Martin Harris takes some pages and shows them to his wife. And then his wife says, okay, we're going to hide these and see if he can write it again using the stones, because if the stones are legit, he should be able to come up with the exact same stuff. And then Joseph Smith realizes he's not going to be able to do that. And then so he says, oh, God's pissed at me. We got to wait for a while, and then I'll come up with a new thing, and it will be a little bit different, but more or less the same. Am I making crap up, or doesn't something like that happen?
No, that's a very famous episode in Mormon history.
Yeah.
Martin Harris badgered the hell out of Joseph Smith for the first 116 pages of the manuscript because they had just finished it and he wanted to show his friends about this new thing, right? And so Joseph Smith prayed and God said no, but he kept badgering him. Finally, he gives him the 116 pages and he kept it in a drawer and it was locked all the time. He came home, Martin Harris, and the lock had been broken. The 116 pages were gone. So now Joseph Smith's got a dilemma. There's no way in hell I can retranslate that stuff verbatim. Right. So he says he's punished for a time, and this is probably to give him time enough. He said my translation powers have been taken away. It's probably give him time enough to make up a good story, which he eventually comes up with. He goes, we're going to resume it. And I believe that the first part of the Book of Mormon is an abridgment or a retelling of the 116 pages. The 116 pages were the Book of Lehi, Nephi's father. So the first part of the Book of Mormon, First Nephi, I believe is a retelling of those 116 pages from the son's point of view.
Right, which explains why it might be just a little bit different,
Exactly.
Right.
Same overall effect, but, almost entirely different.
Joseph's explanation for the first 116 pages is just that, well, that's not actually going to be part of the whole thing after all. We're going to keep that part of the story. However, those words don't matter because we're going to change the point of view to a different character in the story and just start over from there. Is that what he said?
He was a little smarter than that. He said that God had foreseen that this would happen.
Oh.
And he provided for this eventuality in the first book of Nephi.
Okay. Interesting enough. But so yeah, that's kind of, I was kind of reminded of that, my recollection of that part of the history just by us talking about kind of like, well, he's made up all these words. Like, does he remember what he's calling these things that he's just making up? I mean, apparently to a certain degree he's good at it, but obviously he got screwed that one time and had to kind of do a little dance and figure out a way to get out of it because he, obviously would have been exposed as not really being translating accurately if it weren't for the fact that he was able to do that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, the way this was presented to me in seminary was that, can you imagine how evil these people are, these tools of Satan? They get to 116 pages, and then what if he did retranslate it correctly? Then they would have erased some of the words and changed the words to make it look like he didn't retranslate it correctly. Those evil, evil people.
Jeez. Some people, where do they get off?
Right.
They're just trying to destroy the work of the Lord.
Yeah. That's kind of what we're doing right now.
I guess so, yeah.
As a interesting aside, word print studies of the Book of Mormon show that the, I believe, First and Second Nephi are different from the next couple of books. So the question is whether that Book of Lehi, there's a manuscript by Solomon Spaulding called Manuscript Found, I think. And there's Ethan Smith's View of the Hebrews, which are very similar in that a tribe kind of broke off from the Jews and sailed over to the Americas. And so the question is, was he working off this manuscript, Solomon Spaulding, which may have been given to him by Sidney Rigdon, who was working in the publishing company that went bankrupt. And so Solomon Spaulding died. He never got his manuscript back. And that has never been found.
Right.
So the idea is maybe that he had that first 116 pages from Solomon Spaulding, and then he had to get together back with Sidney Rigdon or some of these other guys, Oliver Cowdery maybe, and rewrite that in their own words.
Yeah, and one thing, I don't know if this is true or not, but I think I've read somewhere that Sidney Rigdon was known as the guy who just always said, oh crap, and I'm forgetting, what's the phrase that is just over and over again in the Book of Mormon? And it came to pass.
And it came to pass.
Yeah. Do you know if that's correct or not, Chuck?
I don't know if that's correct, but he had an extremely good memory for the Bible. So he was constantly rattling scriptures off of the top of his head. So anytime it refers back to the scripture or Isaiah or all this other stuff, that's probably Sidney Rigdon adding that stuff in. That's probably not Joseph Smith.
You know, one thing that occurs to me is it's really convenient for Joseph Smith that his punishment was that his translation powers were taken away for a period of time.
Yeah. Nope, sorry, can't do it. Just can't do it right now.
Right, now what would have been a really compelling punishment would have been for God to say, all right, Joseph, you are not going to rest until these 116 pages are retranslated word for word.
Exactly as they were.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But in the revelation that he received punishing him, it said that the wicked men, even if he were to translate it, they would change the own translation. Yeah. So it's a catch-22. And John Smith, smart guy, you know, he knows he's screwed here.
Yeah.
He knows. So he's got to buy himself some time to figure something out.
Yeah, I mean, it's a catch-22. What can God do? He's trapped.
Exactly. The omnipotent ruler, supreme ruler of the universe.
With no way out.
He's cornered because someone snuck into Martin Harris's locked drawer. Jeez.
Oh, God.
Thwarted by 18th century locksmiths.
The Lord will not allow his work to be squashed. So he foresaw this in 600 BC and provided a way out.
Rather than just like making the lock impenetrable or something of that nature, rather than preventing them from being stolen.
Or leading Joseph Smith back to the 116 pages.
Yeah,
no
right.
one knows what happened to that. No one knows what happened to those pages. Those are still out there somewhere. It's probably locked in someone's trunk.
He had the seer stones that he used all the time to find interesting stuff. He found the needle in, I think, Martin Harris's haystack. He could have used those seer stones to re-find the 116 pages.
Absolutely. He went glass-looking and treasure-seeking all the time.
I love the phrase glass-looking.
Yeah. It must have been that along with his translation powers, his ability to use the seer stone's ability to find shit was also suspended. So that's why he was. And by the time he got his powers back, they were too far away, out of range of the seer stones, I guess.
Yeah, it's a great story. That whole episode's a great story.
I'm glad that we got into that because that was really entertaining to listen to.
Do we want to have one more?
Sure, I'm down. I'm not going to provide it because I'm all out of content, but you guys can have at it.
And I'm actually forgetting, did we talk about wheels, axles, and chariots? Eric and I had a brief talk about this before the episode started. Did we talk about that on the podcast already? I forget.
We haven't. We should, because almost always when horses are mentioned in the Book of Mormon, it's in the context of horses and chariots.
Yeah.
We should discuss wheels as well.
Okay,
well,
yeah.
I mean, a lot of chariots are drawn by deers, though, I've heard. Isn't that the case? Isn't that
in the Book of Mormon, there are these raging alpaca that were drawing these chariots.
Yeah, Chuck, so do you want to take the reins on chariots?
Take the reins. I like it. I like what you did there.
Yeah, I didn't specifically prepare for that, so I don't have any references, but there are many references, both I think in the second part of the Book of Mormon, the Jaredite portion, where they got these little glowing stones and they headed over in submarines. So, if you guys aren't aware of that second part, it's at the end of the Book of Mormon, probably tacked on because I believe in the early 1800s they found some monuments that were really impressive in South America. And so the idea was these monuments weren't built by the Native Americans. They were built by a prior white race because there's no way the savage people could do it.
Mm-hmm.
And so
you have to be white and delightsome for that.
Yeah. Joseph Smith hurried and tacked on toward the end a prior older race. So what happened was you're at the Tower of Babel. And you have the brother of Jared, I guess, is a character in the Tower of Babel. They were actually taken by God and separated and sent over. God touched these stones and made them glow. And made these little, literally submarines. They were like, they traveled underneath the water, and they arrived in the Americas and flourished and had massive wars. And so you have chariots there as well. And so that's Tower of Babel's probably what, 2000, I think is what they were saying, 2000. And so these massive, massive wars, and they're talking about millions, I think, of people. So there are chariots way back then. Of course, I don't believe chariots were introduced until the probably 1500s. I may be wrong on that.
Yeah, I don't know.
I may be wrong on that. I know in Egyptian civilization, I think they were initially conquered in the 1500s by a group of chariots. That made the difference. I think it was the chariots. Anyway, in the Book of Mormon itself, the Book of Mormon proper, from 600 AD or 600 BC to 400 AD, there's tons of chariots as well. And they're all drawn by horses. So whatever animal that you think should be the horse instead of an actual horse, because they didn't exist, you have to put that animal like deer or tapirs, and you have to hook them up to chariots and have them draw all these people. And so, I was going to say, the chariots also bring up the wheels, right? There's no evidence of any wheel,
Right.
that was ever used. You have roads for the Incas, but these roads are steep and narrow, and they're not really developed for wheels. There are some toys, I think, that were buried with children that may have had wheels, or they may have been put in there by post-Columbian people who had broken into the tomb. But they never sized it up if they were there. There's no evidence of any chariots, no evidence of any wheels. And again, there's a whole industry that makes this stuff.
Right.
We don't have any evidence of that either.
Yeah.
And we don't have any paintings of chariots or wheels. Zero. Nothing.
Yeah. Now, as for chariots, I've got two apologetic responses for this, both of which I find hilarious. The first one suggests that, what we think of as chariots, this sort of Roman chariot, horse-drawn, a guy or two in the back, that's not really what we're supposed to take from this. What it's more representative of is what's called I don't know how to pronounce it, a leader or a litter or something like this. This is a hand-drawn. You'll see these a lot of times, there's like some big emperor or some person dressed very authoritatively, so he's some big fancy guy. And then he's sitting on a little platform that's being carried by 4 or 5 people.
Oh, okay.
I'm astounded to think about how ineffective that would be in a battle situation.
Right. Well, are they... A bunch of guys with really big book packs. Big book packs
Right.
are gonna win us the battle today.
What possible advantage does that give you to have 4 or 5 guys carrying another guy? You're not going to get up very high. You can't move very quickly. As soon as you take out one of those guys, that entire unit pretty much dissolves.
They're totally defenseless.
Probably the other 3 guys who are carrying it are probably going to get squashed by it once one of the guys gets taken out.
It's going to become dangerous for the people carrying it.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, but I mean, everywhere around here in the Book of Mormon, they're talking about horses and chariots.
Exactly.
So,
right.
When in Alma, I think King Lamoni is telling somebody to prepare his horses and chariots. What does that mean if a bunch of dudes are just going to carry him around?
Right. Yeah, in order to believe that that's a good explanation for what you read about in the Book of Mormon, you've got to disbelieve the Book of Mormon, where it's talking about the horses that are leading the chariots.
Yeah.
I think it's feasible that about 4 or 5 deer could coordinate and carry a giant platform into battle. 1 or 2 guys standing on top of it. I could see that.
Yes.
So
They just were really good at training the deer to walk in unison. Keep the balance and everything.
right.
Just domesticated those so that they would be charioteers. Mm-hmm. Or the llamas. They were just
there is the distinction in there between the wild deer and the domesticated deer, is there not? Or was that? That might have been the goats. I'm sorry.
It was
the goats.
Yeah. They maybe just forgot to mention the domesticated deer. Then it's fine. I'm sure they're in there.
Yeah. So the other apologetic response to chariots and wheels basically just admits defeat. It says, it seems that most of the chariots during the Book of Mormon times didn't survive. That's true. There's no archaeological evidence for it. But the same exact thing happened during the Exodus, in which the, quote, 600 chosen chariots from Exodus 14:6 and all the chariots of Egypt didn't survive into the Red Sea. And I'll say, yep, you're right. No archaeological evidence for that either.
Yeah. Perhaps it's for the same reason? I don't know.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you can't really back that up with another unsubstantiated claim.
Yeah, right.
But again, we have pictures. We have chariots from King Tut's tomb. We've got chariot wheels. I believe, wasn't there in one of our episodes on the Exodus, Leighton had mentioned that someone was claiming that they found a chariot wheel at the bottom of some shallow sea. So it does happen. I mean, we do find them. And we have writings, and we've got pictures, and all the other stuff. I mean, we have frescoes all over the place of people in chariots.
Yeah, well, battles are very iconic things to paint and to depict.
If anything,
those show up all the time.
If anything, that defense or that sort of apologist response, as far as them saying oh well, we didn't find any from Egypt or whatever, but then if you take a look at the Egypt side, and they've got pictures and things that we don't have on the Mormon side, actually sort of makes it less likely to believe that the Mormons are correct in what they're saying.
Right. They'll say the same thing about horses and Genghis Khan or Attila Hun or something like that. These guys are all on horseback, but we haven't found any evidence of any horses. They just don't fossilize very well. But the problem is, in that case, they're wrong. We do have
right. That's kind of a problem. When you're demonstrably wrong, I suppose that's a bit of an issue that you kind of need to address.
Exactly. But you can say that with extreme confidence, and no one will call you on it.
Yeah, because you're speaking to an audience full of people who want to believe that this book is true, this book is right, and if you're giving a defense of it, then they are very happy to hear it and believe it.
Right. Confirmation bias. They will absolutely hear everything that you say, and when they're talking to someone else who is bringing up all this stuff, it just bounces right off of them. I mean, I've seen it in person. It does not affect them in the least.
Right.
That's interesting.
Because what they're really saying when they say that's interesting, what they're really saying is, I don't care about what you just said.
Yeah.
in one ear and out the other.
I'd rather not talk about this anymore.
Yeah, right.
That's what
yes.
they're
saying. Can we talk about something that doesn't make me uncomfortable, please? That's what I would like to do.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right, well, I think that's more or less going to wrap it up. Aside from just, I guess, kind of tying this all together, every single thing that we've talked about, wheels and coinage and animals and iron and stuff, these are all things that Joseph Smith was intimately familiar with in the 1800s. These are things that were well known and well established, and when Joseph Smith would talk about these things to people, they all knew what he was talking about. But over and over again, archaeology just doesn't support this whatsoever. And that's the problem with these anachronisms. We should expect to find exactly these types of anachronisms if the Book of Mormon is a product of the 1800s.
I mean, it just becomes more and more apparent the more you get into it that it was just a book written by a guy or a couple of people, contributing who didn't very carefully research the era that they were writing about, and they just got a whole lot of stuff wrong.
Right.
I mean, think of the odds that if you were yourself translating a document from the Americas in 200 BC, that they wouldn't have anything new to tell you, that you wouldn't come up with one thing that just kind of flabbergasted you and was completely unfamiliar. The closest we get are those two animals that he brought up that he couldn't.
Right, which those are also made up words, right? If I'm not mistaken.
He just makes up two words. But that's the closest we get. We don't get any societal differences. These guys are exactly the same as Europeans. They wage war exactly the same as Europeans. They trade money exactly the same as Europeans. These are Europeans. They're not even Jews. I mean, for God's sakes. They're not even Hebrews. They're Europeans.
Right. And so I guess to close with a quote from Joseph Smith talking about the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon was the most correct book on earth and is the keystone of our religion. And a man would get nearer to God by abiding by its precepts than by any other book. So It seems like Joseph Smith really wanted us to think, to describe it as the most correct book on earth, that's a pretty high standard.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's been revised and edited something like 6,000 times, so.
Right.
Well, so that means that, the 6,000th edition is the 6,000th most correct book on earth, and the only more accurate books are, maybe a different edition. That's all that means.
Yeah, I mean, you'd think if it were the most accurate book on earth, by editing it or revising it, you could only make it less accurate.
Right. Yeah, and certainly if you're going to go with a tight translation theory, you definitely don't want to edit it. This is the Word of God. This is exactly what God said. God doesn't speak to us very often, so it would be stupid to change what he says when he does speak to us.
You should keep all of those grammatical errors from the supreme being of the universe.
I think God would sound a little nicer if he added a few more adjectives, so we'll just change that around a little bit.
God's up there. Did I put enough "and it came to pass" in there?
Right.
Add 6 more.
Damn it, I knew that should have been a semicolon. Damn it. Not a comma, semicolon. Shit.
Ah, damn, that was a hyphen. I meant an M dash. What's the one change that happened? It was in the original 1830 version, it was white and delightsome, and now it's been changed to, is it white and something else?
It's pure.
It's pure now.
Oh, right, because that's a little bit less culturally insensitive. That was probably a wise move by them to change that.
Although all of the stuff about their skin becoming whiter when they're less sinful and they're more righteous, that's all still in there.
Right, yeah.
Okay, well, I didn't say that it was a great message. I was just saying maybe pure would be a nicer word to use than lighter or whiter.
Right.
Maybe eventually it'll say, like, my brethren, I hope that your skins will be as pure as theirs instead of as white.
Right. We've got to make the Word of God better in baby steps.
That probably that probably won't be until the 8,000th edition instead of the 6,000th edition.
See if we can make God less of a racist in the next.
Yeah, in the Book of Mormon, God definitely comes across as, someone's embarrassing racist grandparents.
Right.
Totally true. Totally true.
Yeah.
God is from a different time, okay? God's from a different era. That's all that is.
Yeah.
You can't really blame God for it. I mean, come on.
Yeah. All right, well, any other comments? We can wrap this up otherwise.
No, I'm good. I think what you'll see is that the Mormon Church is going to start de-emphasizing the Book of Mormon.
I've heard that,
less
yeah.
emphasis on that. As time goes on, you'll see less emphasis on it. That's my prophecy for this podcast.
Yeah, I think I'll agree with you on that one. How long after we legalize gay marriage do you think it's going to take for the Mormon Church to acknowledge gay marriage as well? Or do you think that's going to happen?
I'd give it 20 years.
20 years.
Once everybody in the world believes that it's absolutely bigoted thing to do not to marry gays, then they'll come up with some revelation saying, oh yeah, God just woke up and guess what? I'm now going to reveal it to you. It's okay.
And do you think we're going to actually get the prophecy, or is this going to be another press release?
It'll be a press release.
It'll be like at the halftime show of a BYU football game. The marching band will spell it out on the field.
They'll all come out.
Right.
Yeah.
We're gay, and God says that's all right. Yeah, literally, it'll be 10 and 20 years after it's embarrassingly bigoted to hold that opinion. 20 years later, they'll come out and say it.
Right.
I mean, I've said this in the past, but I mean, in my opinion, it already is today embarrassingly bigoted to hold that opinion. But I mean, you think it's just going to take like every other major religion arriving at that same conclusion?
Yeah, it's going to take a greater consensus than what we've got today.
Once Alabama okays gay marriage, then
okay, so there you go. That's the benchmark. Then that's like the we can start the 20-year clock right then when Alabama acknowledges gay marriage. Okay, right. Sure.
Unless if the federal government threatens to yank its tax-exempt status, you'll get the revelation tomorrow. Fucking
right, yeah. Right. If there's money involved, if there's tax-exempt status, that is going to be a revelation tomorrow.
Yeah, that's
guaranteed. And if that would happen, then they would 20 years from now say, we were among the first churches. See how true we are?
Oh, right, exactly.
Right, yeah. Oh, geez. Give me a break.
No, what's going to happen is if the federal government threatens their tax-exempt status, about 2 minutes after that press release, we're going to get another press release where they say, listen, we got a revelation. Gays are all right. But this was long before the federal government said so.
Right, absolutely. Yeah. We've been holding on to this revelation for the past 10 years.
Right.
This was actually given to Spencer W. Kimball, but we were afraid he was senile when he gave it, so sitting on it.
We've been sitting on it. I like that.
All right, Chuck. Well, thank you so much for being on with us. It was a pleasure speaking with you. Like I said in our email correspondence, the Irreligiosophy podcast was definitely a big inspiration for NonTheology. I mean, we chose a name that was a little bit easier to spell, but...
Thanks. I had a great time. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it was a pleasure having you here.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for me as well. I had probably more fun recording this episode than maybe any other episode we've done. Not that we have a huge, sample size. We've only got 15 episodes or so, but of the 15, I think maybe this is my favorite one. So thanks a lot for coming on. We appreciate it.
Right on. You bet. You guys take it easy.
Yeah, you too.
Thanks.
Have a good night, Chuck.
You too. Bye.
See, Eric, now wasn't that fun?
That was a lot of fun, yeah.
Oh, what does this mean? On Skype, Chuck Morrison wants to connect with you? What does that mean?
Chuck Morrison wants to connect with you? What is he, gay? I thought he said he had a wife.
All right, Eric, are you ready to troll the shit out of our guest?
I'm starting to think maybe it's not such a great idea, but I also think he's probably going to find it funny. So.
Yeah, I think he will find it funny. Yeah, Eric, that's actually a really good point, which is a great segue for introducing our guest for today. So without further ado, we are joined on the line by the creator of the Irreligiosophy podcast, Matthew Wakefield.
Hey, Matt, how you doing? Thanks for coming on the show. We really appreciate it.
Are you guys talking to me?
Yes, haven't actually started the show yet.
Let me see if I can get the audio here figured out. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, you're coming through good on my end.
Is that any better? That's by the headset.
That sounds really good for me.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Looks like I'm hearing you through my headset now, so that's good.
Fantastic.
All right, cool.
One thing real fast. Chuck, you're a doctor, aren't you?
That's right.
So, a random question before we start the show. Do you have any recommendations for a prolapsed podcast?
Is there an ointment or like a topical for us that might help us out? We've been having issues.
It's really painful when we upload.
When we upload.
That's a serious problem. I think that requires a specialist.
Oh, okay. All right. I thought maybe we could just go to the local pharmacy, get that.
No. I don't think there's any Viagra for podcasts.
Well, that's not necessarily the problem.
We've got that.
There's no
covered.
medicine for a prolapse podcast. That's surgery.
All right. Well, I guess we'll have to cancel the episode then. Thanks for taking the time to
Yeah.
No problem. Nice having me on. Thanks.
Yeah, it was great talking to you. In Alma 26, it says, "Now when Lamoni had heard this, he caused that..." Damn it, I hate reading the Book of Mormon.
So do a lot of people.
Yeah.